All right, so note that the bryophytes show advancement over the algae because of the development of organ, which is the archegonia. And the archegonia that we're talking about is actually the female organ. And because they possess the female organ, they tend to behave like the pteridophytes because the pteridophytes too possess the archegonia, which means that there is always a bridge between the algae and the pteridophytes. Pteridophytes are those ones that possess vascular bundles. And when they ask you that which of the non-vascular are very close to the pteridophytes, it's actually the bryophytes. And when you're asked to give reasons, just tell them because of the development of organ and particularly the archegonia. But then they also differ from the pteridophytes because they lack vascular bundles, which means that because the bryophytes do not possess vascular bundles, they are not pteridophytes. But they are closer to the pteridophytes because they possess the reproductive organs. Then we have classification of bryophytes or classification of Bryophyta. Now, whenever I use the word Bryophyta, I'm talking about a particular division. Do you understand? But whenever I use the word Bryophytes in this class, I'm talking about examples of the Bryophytas. So, whenever I'm using the word interchangeably, try to understand what I'm actually trying to say. So, for the classification of Bryophyta, we have three classifications, or we have three classes. Now, these three classes, the major thing you should take note of is that one is liverworts, the other is hornworts, and the last is Moses. These are the three things we have there. We are talking about classification. All right, the first thing I mentioned is the liverworts, and the next is actually hornworts, and the last is actually Moses. All right, for the liverworts, the name of that class in the real sense is actually Hepaticae. The word Hepaticae is actually very close to the word hepatic. And when we talk about hepatic cells, we actually mean the cells of the liver, which means that liverworts can actually be used to treat liver-related diseases. Now, note that there's something we call D of S. Okay, D of S means doctrine of signature. Now, this doctrine of signature is the use of physical properties of certain plants to treat certain organs. For instance, we can use liverworts because it's looking like the liver, which is an organ in human. So we can use liverwort to treat liver-related diseases. And that idea is actually coming from the doctrine of signature. The doctrine of signature is actually a historical belief where plants are actually used to treat certain organs based on the shape of the plant, the color, and some other reasons like that. Okay, so whenever they ask you if the liverworts can be used to treat liver-related disease, the answer is yes. Then we have the second class, which is the class hornworts. This hornwort is actually a shortened word. What is actually called is horned liverworts. Okay, so this horned liverwort, when they ask you to write the classification, the first thing you're going to write is actually the Hepaticae. The next thing is actually the Anthocerotae. So every other meaning you want to put after Hepaticae and Anthocerotae should come after writing it, just as it is written in the notes. All right. So we have examples of each of these classes. Okay. So the example of liverworts, we have the Riccia and we have the Marchantia. So for the hornworts, the example we have is the Anthoceros. And lastly, we have the Moses. Basically, we call it the Muscae, the class Muscae. So for the class Muscae, the major example we have there is Funaria. So Funaria is actually a moss. All right, this ends the study on the classification of the Bryophytes. Now, in case they ask you to explain the biology of a particular bryophyte, or probably ask you to give the botanical classification, don't forget we have an acronym. I taught you that when I was teaching algae, that the acronym is KPCOF-GS. And we said that the K is telling us the kingdom that that organism belongs. So if I ask you to do the classification of Machantia now. You're going to tell me that Machantia belongs to the kingdom plant. Now, the phylum or the division of Machantia would actually be Bryophyte. Then we have the class. The class of Machantia. Machantia belongs to the class Hepaticae. All right. The order Machantia belongs to. The class Hepaticae has only one order, which is the Machantiae. All right. Which family does it belong? You're going to put it there. And the genus and the species it belongs. All right. Let's see an example of how to write the botanical classification of a particular plant given to us. So here I classified Ricea. So the kingdom Ricea belongs is actually Plantae, and it belongs to the subkingdom, which is the cryptograms. Then the division it belongs to is actually the division Bryophyta and the class Hepaticae, just as we did. Then the order it belongs to is actually the Machantias, because under the Hepaticae we have only one order, which is the Machantias. Then it belongs to the family Rizicaceae, okay? And the name of that plant is actually Ricea, and the species is SP. So which means that Ricea is called Ricea SP. All right. And that's the botanical classification. So now we are moving to the alternation of generation. Don't forget that we said that the characteristics is actually sand. So, and we said that the S represents small, which are the small terrestrial plants. We said here that it talks about the alternation of generation. And the R is talking about reproduction. And we said that the reproduction can either be sexual or it is asexual. Then we talked about no, they have no roots. And we also said that they possess no vascular bundles. Okay. And when we say they possess no vascular bundles, it means that they do not have phloem and xylem. And the last thing we said under the characteristics is that they possess, or they are usually found in damp, shady environments. Okay, that's the summary of the characteristics. So we've talked about it being small in our definition, and we've explained it. So now we're talking about the alternation of generation. Now, the concept of alternation of generation in Bryophyta is thus. So the first thing we need to understand is that the bryophytes undergo two phases or two life cycle, which means that whenever we talk about life cycle and alternation of generation, we mean the same thing. Do you understand? So in their life cycle, they possess two generations, which capacitate them to be able to switch from one generation to another. So the first generation they have or they possess in their life cycle is actually the gametophysic generation. Now, one other thing that this concept of alternation of generation explains to us is the reproduction. Okay, so whenever you're dealing with the life cycle of a particular plant, you are also talking about reproduction. The life cycle sometimes or most times explain the reproduction. So for the gametophysic generation that they undergo, the gametophysic generation is actually haploid. But don't forget that the gametophysic generation is all about the production of gametes. Then for the gametophysic generation, it actually starts from spore and ends with gametes. The gametes it ends with is actually the gametes produced. Okay. So which means that if gametophysic generation would start, it must start with a spore. And that spore must be N. When I say N, it means that it is haploid. Now, after undergoing a series of steps, the last thing it will generate is actually gametes. And the gametes it will generate is going to be male gametes and the female gametes. All right. So when the male gametes and the female gametes are now formed, they can now fuse to start another generation entirely. Okay. Don't forget, gametes are still haploids. Now, when they now fuse, at this junction, they will fuse actually. When they fuse, they produce the zygotes. At that point, where they produce the zygotes, it is no longer gametophysic generation because zygotes is the fusion, or zygote is produced as a result of fusion of two ends, which is one end from the male and the other end from the what? Female. And that makes it two end. At this point, they are no longer undergoing, or they have left the gametophysic generation already. Okay, so what then happens? We say that they have entered into the sporophytic generation, which means that the sporophytic generation is actually characterized by two N, which is the diploid. All right. So, but we are not explaining the life cycle yet. We're just explaining the concept of the alternation of generation. Okay, moving on. Note that the gametophyte generation is dominant. I think we've mentioned that earlier. Only the bryophytes possess the gametophyte generation has dominance, which means that when you get to pteridophytes might not. And using the word might is actually still giving room for probability. But let's say will not possess gametophyte generation because only the bryophytes possess gametophyte generation has dominance. Not that the the pteridophytes won't possess gametophyte generation. They would, but it is not dominant. What will it be then? It will be dependent. Yeah, it will be dependent. So when we say it's only the bryophytes that possess gametophyte generation, another way we can say that is that gametophyte generation is dominant or it's independent, either ways. Now, but note also that the gametophyte generation actually is the one that gives rise to the sporophytic generation. So this space here is actually noting the sporophytic generation, which means that if the gametophyte generation from here to this garment is not or is not undergone by the plant, there's nothing like sporophytic generation. That's what it means. So which means that the sporophytic generation will have to depend on the gametophyte generation for its own production or for its own life cycle. Do you understand? And that is the concept of alternation of generation. So let's talk about this sporophytic generation and see what it has to offer us. We are here. This is the sporophytic generation, and the sporophytic generation is diploid, which means that it will start with the oosphere. Another name we'll call the oosphere is actually the zygote. So the zygote has another name called the oosphere. That's what I mean. So when it starts with the oosphere, it ends with a mother cell. In summary, we've said that alternation of generation is actually talking about two things. The first thing it's talking about is actually that it has a gametophytic generation, or the alternation of generation is divided into two: gametophytic gene and sporophytic gene. The first one is N, which is haploid, and the second one is 2N, which is diploid. This one starts with a spore, and the spore is always N. Everything that happens here is actually N, which means that they must all be haploid. So from this spore, it gets to the gametes, and gametes are haploid too. Okay, and the next thing we talked about the sporophytic is that for the sporophytic generation is actually 2N, which means that before getting to sporophytic generation, zygote must have been formed, which means that fusion or what we call syngamy must have taken place. In that sense, a zygote is usually generated, and that zygote this time contains twice the number of chromosomes or twice the number of gametes produced for each of the male and the female. Then it ends with a mother cell. Mother cell is actually a germination, which means that when the zygote germinates, it germinates into a mother cell. And the cycle continues. Now, the mother cell is still to end. But from the mother cell back to, what's it called? Back to this, for the cycle to continue, the mother cell will have to undergo something we call meiosis. All right. So when meiosis occurs, it's produced back N, which starts another gametophyte generation. And that's how the life cycle continues. But don't forget that I said that whenever you're talking about alternation of generation or life cycle, it actually relates to the concept of reproduction too. Because it is the concept of reproduction you will try to understand alongside the alternation of generation, or you understand the concept of reproduction first before talking about the alternation of generation. Why? Because you need to understand that for them to undergo that life cycle or that alternation of generation, they make use of some reproductive organs, and this aspect of reproduction can well be understood when you take reproduction into account. So when we are explaining the sexual reproduction, which is actually in line with the gametophytic gene, because the sexual is when after producing the gametes, they will now copulate or they would have to fuse. That fusion is actually all about the sexual reproduction. Now, what is now produced, which is the zygote, will now undergo this asexual reproduction. So, there's no how you are going to reach that point where the two gametes meet, just like egg and sperm, okay, meets, without talking about the organs and the gametes involved. For the male gametes of a bryophyte, of any bryophyte, I mean, whether Riccia, Machantia, or Funaria, the male organ is always called the antheridia. Now, for the male gametes, which means that organs generates gametes. So, the organ in a man is the penis. Around the penis, we have the gonads, which is testes and the likes of it, okay? Those ones generate the sperm. Just as it is in human, so it is in these plants that we're talking about. For them, their organ is not the penis. Instead, the organ is actually called antheridia. Then, this antheridia give rise to a gamete called antherizoid. Don't forget that. One is antheridia and the other one is antherizoid. So for the female organ, what does the female organ contains? The female organs contains what we call archegonia. Archegonia is actually a plural word, okay? Then archegonium is actually the singular of archegonia. Now, what does it produce? It produces the female gametes. The female gametes is actually called the oosphere. The oosphere. I didn't write in the notes, but it's actually called the oosphere. Now, please don't confuse yourself with the word oospore and oosphere. Take note of these two words. Oosphere is actually the female gamete of archegonia, but oospore is actually a spore. Do you understand? A spore is no longer gametophytic, it's actually sporophytic from the word sporo. It means that a spore. Do you understand? So, whenever you're mentioning these words, try as much as possible to understand what you're saying. So, we have oosphere, which is oosphere is the female gamete. Oospore, from the word spore. Once you hear the word spore, you know that you are talking about sporophytic. When you hear sphere, there is no spore in sphere. Hence, it is the female gamete of archegonia. Then we have the asexual reproduction. So, when we talk about asexual reproduction, we are talking about the formation of adventitious branches, germ formation, and decaying of the mother cell. I'll be bringing more light on the asexual reproduction as we go further in the lecture. So, the next thing we need to study before we get to the life cycle itself, where we actually drill the life cycle, is actually the root system. Then I think after that, we move to the life cycle and we study the life cycle together. And I think that's all as far as bryophytes are concerned. Lastly, before we move to the life cycle, we have the root system. Don't forget that bryophytes or Bryophyta in general, we say that they do not possess a root system. So how do they undergo absorption of food, okay, and minerals? They use hyphae. Hyphae is actually a structure that is used for the absorption of mineral resources from whether dead organic matter or so, okay? Then for bryophyte, it doesn't mean that bryophyte feeds on dead organic matter, no, okay? But they possess a structure that looks like a root system. That structure is called hyphae, and this hyphae helps them in the absorption of mineral resources or mineral salts. Another thing they use that hyphae for is they use it for anchorage, which means that they use it to get hold on something firmly. So in a word, we have said that in the place of the root system, they possess hyphae. Now, this hyphae can either be used to get mineral resources, that's for absorption, okay, or the hyphae is used for what? Anchorage. Then we move to the life cycle of Riccia. And don't forget that Riccia is actually a liverwort. And when we say liverwort, we mean the Hepaticae. Now, studying the life cycle of Riccia, we have Riccia. Riccia is N, okay? Why do we say Riccia is N? Because Riccia is actually haploid on its own, which means that all sporophytes, the life cycle they start with is actually haploid. So, which means that they don't usually exist as diploid. Hence, they don't have to necessarily undergo meiosis before starting their life cycle. No, they start direct, okay? So for Riccia, which is N, Riccia starts by the development of two organs. So we have the archegonia. Archegonia is actually the female organ. And the next thing I have is the antheridia. So don't forget, we said under reproduction, we said that every organ generates or give rise to a gamete. So, and we said that the gamete for antheridia is actually antherizoid. Then we said that the gamete for this is actually ovum, or what you call oosphere. Oosphere. Don't mistake it with oospore. Then in the long run, both of them fuses. All right. That fusion is called syngamy or fertilization. Fertilization is the coming together of two gametes from different organs or from opposite organs. Now, when that fertilization occurs, the male gamete, it will have a nuclei, sure, right? For the female gamete too, it will also have a nuclei of its own. These two nuclei, when they come together, they form something we call zygotes. But then the process of two nuclei fusing together is called karyogamy. Karyogamy. Okay, I'm just using that opportunity to teach you other concepts that you are likely to come across. So karyogamy is the fusion of two nuclei from opposite strain. Okay, the first strain is the antherizoid. The second one, which is the opposite, is actually the ovum. All right, but don't forget that what they form is actually called zygote. Another name we call zygote is actually the oosphere. Now, you see this point where the zygote is actually 2n here. It's actually 2n. Does that make sense? But from here down to this place, to the rhizia itself, okay, from here down here, that is where we have the gametophytic generation. You just write on it, just like I wrote it here on this like this. That's the gametophytic generation. So this study ends the gametophytic generation. Okay. Now you must not draw this line, this straight line I drew here. You must not draw it to touch the zygote. Why? Because once it touches the zygote, you are automatically telling us that the zygote is part of the gametophytic generation, which is wrong. So once you get to that zygote, it means that you have assumed that sporophytic generation has started already. When zygote develop, provided that the conditions are favorable, what happens? It generates what we call the mother cell. When the mother cell is actually generated, don't forget the mother cell is still 2n. From the mother cell, asexual reproduction can take place there. Because for asexual reproduction to take place, this mother cell will have to decay. The last step is actually the decaying of this mother cell for asexual reproduction, right? But before the decaying of the mother cell will occur, the germ formation must occur, adventitious branches must be produced, then there is decay. That's asexual reproduction. But in the absence of asexual reproduction, what happens? There is generation of spore. And that generation of spore would not happen or would not occur without meiosis. So what happens here is that meiosis occurs, then a spore is generated. That spore, in another word, we call it rhizia. But before a spore can become rhizia, there must be development of the spore, just like the zygote develops into the mother cell. The same thing happens there. Do you understand? Then let's go to the next life cycle. We have the life cycle of Funaria. Don't forget that Funaria is actually a bryophyte, and where it belongs to is actually the musci. In short, it happens that I gave you only Funaria as part of the moss. Do you understand? Now, this Funaria that we're talking about, because it belongs to musci, does not mean that its own alternation of generation will be different. No, it will still have gametophytic generation as dominant. Then we stated an information here that its embryo is usually divided into the fruit, the cella, and the capsule. I will explain that. Now, let's quickly go into the life cycle of Funaria. So we have Funaria. Funaria is still N, which means that it confirms that it is gametophytic. Now, this Funaria possess the male and the female organ. The male and the female organ generates the male and the female gamete, which is the antherizoid and the oosphere. Now, the oosphere produces an oospore, or what we call a zygote. Now, this zygote develops into an embryo, which is a small baby kind of thing. This embryo can further be divided into the cella the foot and the capsule. The capsule is that part that continues the life cycle to develop into the mother cell. And this mother cell can undergo meiosis. Okay, so meiosis to form spore, and that develops into funaria. It's as simple as that. This life cycle is very simple. But don't forget to draw your line to show that this is gametophytic generation. And I told you that the line must not touch the oosphere or the oospore rather. So I'm giving you an assignment. The assignment is for you to draw the life cycle of Marchantia. So you're going to draw the life cycle of Marchantia. In the course of drawing the life cycle, try to bring out your gametophytic and sporophytic generation. Then explain the reproduction of, or how the life cycle explains the reproduction. So I'm giving you two assignments in one. Draw the life cycle, right? Don't forget your gametophytic and sporophytic, but then explain to me how the life cycle reflects the reproduction of Marchantia. And it's as simple as that. And lastly, what's the economic importance of bryophytes or of Bryophyta? So one of the economic importance of bryophytes is that they don't submit to, or they are not usually subjected to erosion, which means that they are not usually flooded kind of thing. Now, how do they do that? They bind themselves to solid particles, like fixed particles on the soil. Do you understand? Which makes them firm on ground. In short, they themselves can contribute to the firmness of that region they occupy. Do you understand? Such that when erosion comes, what happens? They remain fixed, unshaken in the soil. So that's one of the economic importance. So somebody will now sit and think, how is it an economic importance to me? All right. That question will be asked from you in class. So the next thing we have is soil enrichment. Of course, they enriches the soil, which means that they add to the soil nutrients. And these are the two economic importance I noted here. You can look for two other economic importance to make up your note. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you in the next one.